can be taken as a representative sample, and subsequent tests can be applied to generalize the population.
But I'm just thinking they are very different because the health-seeking behaviors are very different for those who come from those who don't even come.
In such case, if those who come are different from those
Who don't come.
For instance, let's take a topic. If you are interested to study patient satisfaction or satisfaction of pregnant women with a service, those who are included in a study with confidence sampling are likely to be representative of all pregnant women who give the service. We can confidently include until we achieve our sample. That will be the same as taking simple random sampling.
I wouldn't agree with that one. That's not a random sample. Sorry?
Delay in health-seeking behavior.
For example, there are mothers are delaying in several delays. So in that case, how do you sample the mother from the facility? If you are not using the component sampling, because the component sampling, you start from the Monday to whatever weeks until you get sample size determined. But if you try to select, for example, every systematic, if you say systematic, I'm sure we can't apply a single random sampling for the one who is coming from the service. Because they are not coming from...
Yeah, we don't even know them.
Yeah, we don't. But still for the systematic, for rare kids, for like attending delivery services, if you try to use systematic random sampling, you may need 6 months to fulfill your sample size. And that is the problem for the students who have only 2 months for data collection and analysis.
But the question is, whom do they want to answer this question for? Is it for those women who come in 6 months or for all women?
No.
That goes back to who is your target population.
Your target population is the one who is utilizing the service. Has to be the one who came from during the data collection period are selected from the population, and they can represent the people who are utilizing the service, not the population. But if you want to generalize for the whole patients or clients who are using the services, and if you take sample during your data collection period, I think that can be representative of the people who are using the service, not excluding those. Those are already excluded because they are not coming from the So you want to study the characteristics of people who are coming for the service, and you want to sample that because you can't include all people who are coming for the service. I think in this case, convenience sampling is enough. The convenience is that during you include all clients who came during the data collection period until you reach your sample size.
That's not convenience. That anyone who at that material time would come. Convenience is, I will take patients on Monday, those who come on Monday, because it happens that on Monday, that's when I'll be available. And then there are some who are coming on Tuesday, they are not taken. So they don't stand equal chance compared to the ones who come on Monday. But if you say, I'll be taking anyone who comes in these 2 weeks, anyone, and everyone who comes there will get in, it's equal probability.
Yes, but you stop at the data collection.
Yes, but for those whom you took,
the same thing.
they stood equal chance of getting into your study.
Yes, the same thing will happen if you get the adequate sample size within 1 day. That's convenient.
No. If you take 1 day and you know you have...
If you include all patients coming from morning to the evening day, that's convenient.
But then why would you want to take on Monday and finish everything while you know there are likely to come and have different characteristics? Then you do random selection through the whole week.
The same thing that your data collection
You could even ask why stop in a year. So to me there is no convenience. It's everyone who comes stands equal chance.
So if your data collection is for a week, you've covered 7 days, you're quite sure that any difference is a factor. But if it's for 1 day and for 1 hour, you could argue that if it's a big referral hospital, it can take 1 hour. Then you're doing a convenient sampling, and the fact that you're just taking one specific period will bias your sample.
I think it depends on the data collection time and getting the number of samples. Otherwise, it's the same. If that season is not malaria season, and the next month is malaria season, the same thing will happen.
Yeah, it also depends on the condition. If there is seasonality, then of course you may get different. Then 1 week may not be the same as January or March or April. So we also have to factor that in. What differences might be there in terms of the data collection period. As we think of it, we also need to think of the condition and be sure we are choosing a period that will allow us to choose a representative.
Yeah, what I'm saying is whether you take one day or 2 weeks, it's the same. You need that combination sampling because otherwise you have to apply all those characteristics of something embezzle or stratified it by day or clustering. But for me, and for practical reasons, we use most of the time convenience sampling for institutional data collection. And if we are to impact for only those institutions, only for those patients who are eligible.
Okay, and for these sampling techniques, there are some which work for some scenarios and others will not work for some scenarios. Like for example, for simple random sampling, you need to have an idea about the sampling frame. You need to know the population. You can have an idea about the population. For stratified, there are some key things you care about, and that's why you are stratified, to ensure you have enough numbers representing a specific characteristics of interest. For cluster is when maybe there are issues with distance, the population is spread, so you have those geographical locations, and instead of sampling individuals, you are sampling a group. And for systematic, we mainly use them for hospital-based studies, whereby you also don't know the population, but you have an idea about how many patients you see in a year, and to reach your sample size, you come up with an interval to ensure the participants are spread out throughout the whole year. And for example, the DHS uses both the cluster and stratified random sampling. So it's a 2-stage. So there is a multi-stage sampling also. Then the non-probabilistic, there is convenience, there is judgmental, there is quarter, and there is also the snowball sampling. In majority of the snowball sampling, we are mainly using it for hard to reach, when you don't know your participants. So you're using the other participants to bring others. And quarter is when I'm interested in 5 males, 5 females, so I specify my quarter. So this is whereby you pick participants based on your own opinion, that you know they are the ones who have the information you care about. So it's based on your own judgment. Yes. It's a purposive sampling. So you interview people on purpose. So then there's the whole issue of, apart from sampling, is how many people do I need? And I know we talked about this briefly in the morning. And for qualitative, I don't know of any hard or fast rules on the number, but at least there are 2 things to think about for qualitative. Is what sample size will ensure you get to reach saturation or redundancy. But I've gotten all the information, adding new people, I'm not adding any. You have a size that allows you to identify some consistent patterns. And you also need to think about how large a sample do you need to represent the variation that exists in your target population. So you have a population of interest, and you think you've reached enough people to ensure that you've taken care about all the variability that exists in that population. So those are the 2 key things I know for qualitative, unless someone has anything to add on the
criteria says if we take, we may have 1 focus group discussion for male and 1 focus group discussion for female. Or if we have another 3 homogeneity criteria like this, we may have 6 FGDs. So homogeneity criteria may be as sample size for FGDs.
representative in terms of numbers. In terms of variation, you need to try and make sure that your sample size is representative so that you can capture different perspectives. You need to look at maybe what the managers think, what the health workers themselves think, what this other stakeholder thinks, what the other stakeholder thinks, so that at the end of the day, if you're doing a qualitative study, you're not only looking at something from one group's perspective. So we need to take time, depending on what it is that you're looking at. You need to try and make sure that as you do your sampling, whatever you've used, you've covered any different variations.
You want to say maybe those in school, those out of school, males, females, maybe the younger ones and the older ones, but you're still in the same bracket of say 24, so that you cover a wide perspective of
Any other additions on qualitative?
It's not an addition, but it's a question about sampling the population and the target population in community study. For example, if I want to study, want to do a survey around the facility, how is the target population? Is it the whole population of the
We need to go back to what do you want to study in that population? Your question concerns who?
For example, perception and utilization of stress.
By who?
That community, they are not using that facility.
So your focus is the community around the facility. So that is your target population.
So it will be everybody starting from the children to the older.
Now, whom are you worried not utilizing? Is it the children, or is it the mothers, or is it?
Okay, maybe. Okay, it could be adults over 18 and above.
But the mother might report on the child why she's not taking the child to the hospital.
So I just say maybe 40,000 population around facilities like that.
But now the other thing to think about is now what will be your unit of analysis. Is it everybody, or is it just those people who can be able to respond to your questions, or those who can take themselves to a facility? But you need somehow to narrow your focus. Because once you sharpen or narrow your focus on the research question, then you get to know who exactly is your target population. Okay, for sample size, there are reasons why we need to have a sample size. And the number one is that majority of the time it's a requirement. If you're applying for a grant, they need to know how many people you need to study. And other times it's used to do with budget. And there's also the requirement for a statistical justification, which also comes in mainly for grants. And then the whole idea of the fact that you want to draw inference, to draw conclusions from the sample. So we need to know how many people can ensure that I can draw inference with some level of confidence. So that's why we need a sample size. So here, there is the science itself requires us to have a sample size so that we can be sure we made the right decision regarding the effect of an intervention. So if I was testing a new intervention, I need to ensure that if I say it works, it really works. And I want to ensure that I have enrolled enough subjects to be able to adequately address these questions, whereby I can draw my conclusions with some level of confidence. So if I say it works, I have some confidence that it really works. So I need to know how many people do I need to have for me to be able to say with that level of confidence. So that's the validity aspect. Then ethically, we also need to have, there's the issue of too few or too many. So I don't want to have too few subjects that cannot adequately address the study question, because I might have put them under risk for no reason. Maybe I didn't just see an effect because the subjects were too few, yet I subjected them to this. And then there's the issue of too many. We don't also want to expose too many people to a risk. So we need to, I know we talked about the ethics yesterday. So for sample size, there is the ethical aspect. We don't want to study too many or too few. So we all know what's a sample size, and there's another keyword that comes when you're talking about the sample size, which is the power of a study. So the power is all to do with if a limited pool of subjects were available, what is the likelihood or what's the chance of finding a statistical significance of a specific magnitude if it really exists. So we want to have high power, high probabilities or high chance. And the sample size is the number of people who will ensure that we can detect a difference, statistical significant difference, if it truly exists. And for quantitative, because here now we are talking about the quantitative, we already talked about the quant. The key thing we need to have our students thinking about before they can talk about the sample size, they need to be able to answer these questions. Number one being, what's the purpose of the study? Because the research question drives the sample size. So they need also to think about the primary outcome. What is it that they really care about in that research question? And what kind of data is it? Is it continuous or is it categorical? Is it measured in a continuous scale, or is it dichotomous, or is it in categories? Then the other thing they need to start thinking about is how are they going to analyze their data? And if they are testing a new intervention compared to an existing one, they need to think about a difference that will make them say this intervention is better than the other one. Then there is also the issue of what is the variability in the population. If you are focusing on something like blood pressure, how variable is it in the population? Body mass index, how variable is it? So they need to think about the variability, mainly for the continuous outcomes of interest. Then there's bullet number 6 there, which is to do with what we call the type 1 error and type 2 error, which we commit when we are doing research. So the alpha there, Greek letter, I had promised no formula, but I have 2 Greek letters. So there is the type 1 error and the type 2 error, and the type 2, which is
your guides, so that you understand the topic and understand the different facets and the different phases that you're going to look at, especially if we remember Professor Sengoba's presentation yesterday about relationships and complexity. So if you don't think about these things before you go to the field, then when you go there, you may not be able to pick up what you're supposed to be picking up. So also having that framework and understanding a framework that will guide your work before you go to the field, I think is important. And also coding, having maybe more than one person code. Because many times you find that different people will have different perspectives, and sometimes one person does not see this out of a piece of text and someone else is able to read deeper. So I think also having more than one person code when it comes to the coding can help you understand your data or draw out the different things that make.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is the whole issue of data analysis. And for this, we also need to let our students know that they need to come up with a data analysis plan, where they have to think about the methods as well as the softwares, and also how they plan to interpret their findings. And again, the plan should, so the research question we keep talking about, so we need to think about our research question, and if we have any hypothesis, and which data sets we are going to use, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because based on our objective, one objective may only be focusing on a specific subset. Then the variables that we are interested in for our main analysis, the shells, the table shells, both for the univariate and multivariate analysis. And for quantitative, there are several. We can do both the descriptive and inferential statistics, and so they should have what we call the dummy table, which highlights the key variables of interest that they plan to describe. And here it's by use of mainly graphs and frequencies and things like mean. And then for inferential, this is why we have hypotheses we want to test and we want to infer from the sample to the population. And for this, it's important to think about the data set you're dealing with and the key variables, whether they are continuous, whether they are categorical. And when doing this kind of comparisons, I think it's always important to let them know that for quantitative, if they're not familiar, they can consult with a statistician so that they can ensure they have the correct sampling methods, that we can be able to draw inference, and we can also get a clear understanding of the data analysis. Because keeping in mind that there are several assumptions that we make when drawing inference, and we need to check whether those assumptions are, our data verifies those assumptions, or whether our models verify those assumptions. So the inferential, we can do things like estimation, construction of confidence interval, hypothesis testing, modeling, and so as I say, it's important to consult statistics here because of these several things that you make assumptions about.
I find that very often the interest in, when I talk about service delivery and all, is in the two ends. The mean, the average is almost useless. And you're interested in the very best people and the very worst, trying to get some improvement. I wonder whether that will change the approach going back to something and how you look at it, because the interest is not in the middle bit. You need it only so far as to construct the ends, but then when you get to the ends, you tend to get really wild, something gets very wild tailed and so on. So to manage.
So so you are mainly focusing on the quartiles, sort of.
Just about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So either the top 5% or the bottom 5.
So based on your objectives, maybe you might want, maybe instead of looking at it rather as a continuous measure, you might be interested with what proportion is in this lower quartile or what proportion is in this upper quartile. So you can still apply some of the statistical methods, even to be able to analyze if you categorize your data that way. But if you are more interested with like the median rather than the mean, then rather than using the parametric method that we are very used to using, you might want to use some non-parametric methods if your data is highly skewed.
So will you be advocating for that?
Give your data.
For HSR, because we're interested in essentially the outliers, what is not average or what is not median.
But for those ones, what do you want to understand from them? Maybe you giving an example, then maybe we can see.
So we look at health facilities, and I'm wondering why those ones the mortality rate is lower than these other ones.
So
I'm looking at the relationship between, say, human resource practices.
So you want to see whether the practices differ in clinic A versus in clinic B?
Yes, because I picked up that the mortality rates are higher or the morbidity rates are higher for infection, something like that.
And that's why I was thinking maybe I would, rather than dealing with the rate itself, I would consider this as high and this is low, and maybe now I'm only dealing with two groups. And based on the outcome you want, if you want to associate with other variables, it doesn't mean you cannot do parametric. You can still use some like chi-square test or logistic regression. Yeah. Because already you've come up with cutoffs rather than looking at it as a continuous measure. Yeah. But maybe to answer the question why, if you are interested in the in-depth, then maybe you now need to go qualitative. Yeah. Any other question on analysis of quant? For qualitative data, the analysis involves describing, summarizing, and interpreting data for each study unit. And it involves a lot of coding and coming out with things. And coding means going through your data systematically and reading each transcript carefully. And I think, as you said before, that we need to have a plan ahead of time on how we are going to do this, keeping in mind that not everything is of importance. So we need to focus on our objectives. And as she said, we also need to think about the conceptual framework, so that will guide how we do our analysis. So this was just another slide in addition on point about the various tests you might want to use. And the software, there are several. I'm sure I've just listed some few. And I know there's even the one for qualitative, the NVivo and Atlas. So is there anything else I've left out on analysis of qualitative that maybe?
There are a few things I want to share, but it might take like 5 minutes. It's okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
So this was something I used earlier when I was doing some work. They were looking at different tactics you can use to generate meaning for qualitative data. And one of the things we were talking about is you can identify patterns. As you read your data, sometimes you see a pattern coming up. Maybe, to give an example, maybe you're looking at something that is maybe related to, maybe you're looking at maternal mortality, and you're beginning to say that if you maybe did interviews, an easy one is maybe in a rural area and an urban area, or a hard-to-reach area, you may find that whenever you're seeing that a mother died, this mother was in a hard-to-reach area. So you can find that when you look through your data, you begin to see a certain pattern that is being followed over and over again. Or maybe you're seeing that if you have intern doctors who are fresh from school, each time there is a death, maybe it was an intern who was on duty. Or you can find that maybe each time this particular consultant is on duty, there is a death. And so the main point is that you can look out for patterns as you read your qualitative data and you try to see what are these patterns telling me. But it's also important to look out for plausibility. When you look in format interviews or focus group discussions, are the things they are telling you plausible? For example, yesterday, I think when we were giving the example Professor Sengova gave about decentralization and circumcision. If someone says the reason is decentralization and you ask them and they cannot explain, they're just saying it's just decentralization. So they are giving you an explanation that really doesn't hold water. Think about plausibility when you read the interviews to make sure that what they're telling you follows an expected theory of change. And this is where, again, your framework can help you to be able to see whether it's plausible. Then there's also the concept of clustering. Sometimes you can find that you get certain features that are similar in certain groups. Maybe if you're doing work and it involves public facilities and private facilities, you may find that you're getting certain, you're getting some kind of you can be able to cluster some of the findings, so you can cluster into various categories. Then you can also use counting, comparing, and contrasting. In qualitative data, often we don't necessarily count. So some people say don't count how many people in the FGD say this or how many FGD say this, but some schools of thought also say counting, comparing, and contrasting can be important because it contributes to showing you what the majority of the people think or whether something is a major problem or not. Then they say also noting relationships between the variables is important. And yesterday again we said in health systems research we are often looking for relationships. So also as we analyze the data, it's important for us to try and look for these relationships. Then theoretical concepts, we say you should have a framework before you go out. So when you get your data, as you begin to read it, you should also look at your framework. If you're saying that, for instance, if you're doing something to do with incentives, and you're saying if workers are paid more money, they're going to be more hardworking and absenteeism will reduce, then you should try and see whether in your data you're able to pick that up you're picking up the fact that people are being paid more money and they are more available at the facility. Whatever theoretical concepts guided your work, you should check your work against that to see whether it's in line with what you expected. And if it's not in line, then you should also ask yourself, why isn't this in line with what I expected? Maybe what you expected was not correct. Maybe this is just a different finding and you need to investigate further. So thinking of your theoretical concepts and reading your data against those theoretical concepts is important. Then representativeness is also important. We hinted on this a little earlier, that you need to make sure that you've included all the various stakeholders so that when you're presenting your findings, you're not only presenting one view. For instance, if you went to a facility and you only talked to the health worker, they might tell you, our manager is very mean. He insists you come on time. If you don't, they cut your salary. If they do this, then you might go to the manager and the manager tells you a different story and you realize he's actually trying to be more efficient. And then if you go to a public facility and a private facility, you might see a different picture. So that representativeness as you design your study is important to make sure you get all the different angles, and at the end, you're able to pick up different aspects, and especially in health system research, this has become very important because it ensures we've covered all the different angles. Triangulation, we've talked about that already, the importance of that. Weighing the evidence is also important to see whether this is actually something that you need to go forward with. Sometimes it's what the majority say that is important. Sometimes it's one person who says something, but what that person says has a lot of weight. And sometimes it's something that they might say, but probably when you investigate, it doesn't. It's something you don't really want to push. So it's important to be able to weigh the evidence and ensure that what you're saying is credible. Checking on outliers is also important. If there is one place where the findings are just different from the others, it's important for you to probably go back there and try to dig deeper to find out why. And then looking at if the findings are being replicated in different facilities are important. Checking out rival explanations are also important. So you might have your explanation of why you think this is happening, but maybe that is not the explanation. Possibly it's something different. It's good to also look for, check out rival explanations and not only go with your theory, check out what other theories think. And lastly, getting feedback from the key informants and the stakeholders after you analyze the data. I always recommend that you call the people you interviewed and you tell them this is what I've come up with. What do you feel? Do you agree with this? To ensure that what you're actually going to present is a true reflection of what the reality is. So those are some additional things that I thought might be helpful in terms of analyzing.
Thank you for that addition.
On the issue of framework, some of the concepts that are there and some new ones will come. So you have open mind when you are doing the analysis, so you're not intention Yeah, I also have a problem when it comes to counting in qualitative compared to quantitative, whereby the strength of qualitative is not in numbers, it is on the case. How much one can build a case and try to explain it makes more sense than having many people attesting to something that, looking at it, it doesn't tire. And in fact, you find some researchers coming into conclusions just because there were big numbers in terms of those who attested to something compared to another, which I feel maybe that was the place whereby once you have come up with these theories, then you put them to test in quantitative, whereby now you will be free to say majority are of this perspective. That's my...
FG, we know that the unit of analysis is the group. So I find it a challenge to start dividing that group. So, and I'm sure that even the journal where you, for example, publish or send your work, you have issues with that because you have to take the unit of analysis as a group.
No, I've seen publications where qualitative data is reported in numbers. I've seen it.
There are two schools of thought. Here we were looking at male involvement. And some women would say, our husbands are now very involved, they help us, they do this, they do this. And others would say the men are not involved at all. So in the end, when I tried to look and see, in some groups it would be unanimous that they said they're involved. In some groups, when you read through, it's not either or, it's both. Some say they're involved, some say they're not. So in reporting, at that point, it wasn't right to say the men are involved or the men are not involved. I ended up saying there's a mixed picture. Because when you look at the numbers, you see that it's not so much the majority that everyone is saying they've swung. And so the key message was really that it's a mix. So I think that's where the counting,
No, I would just end up with mixed.
Is to say it's mixed.
Yeah.
And mixed.
Rather than saying those who were for were more than
yes.
against. That's I think, is taking too far the qualitative.
It's also important because it just shows that these issues, people have different opinions, and that's the reality that you.
And I think the rationale for an FGD is not necessarily to get consensus. You actually want to get multiple perspectives from the group. So you actually wouldn't. It would be surprising if you got consensus, but it's not necessarily what you whatever. Recently, I also, looking at counting, I submitted some small assignment for some qualitative, and in my reporting, I used to talk about most of the respondents say this, and my supervisor kept on circling the word most, meaning that actually she wasn't in for most meant that the largest number is 60% or what. He said no, you can't be reporting, like that in qualitative research. Again, it's different schools that we might settle in for all this.
So when interpreting the findings, I think the key things to keep in mind is that what you as a researcher are concerned about, and one needs to ensure that they describe their results clearly and in a way that other researchers can compare your own findings with theirs. And also the other thing is to ensure that when analyzing the results, we use the correct statistical methods, such that we don't can justify or can talk with some level of confidence whether what we see is due to chance or due to something else. And then we need to interpret our results in an objective and critical way before assessing the implications and before drawing conclusions. So I think we need to really focus on this when interpreting our results, being objective and critical to some level. And then the other thing is that we need to remember that for other people who are looking at our results, like health professionals, they might, or who are hearing about our results, should be able themselves to interpret them correctly and assess the implications for their work. So we need to ensure that it's in a language that other people can be able to interpret our findings. And also for policymakers, they should be aware of possible pitfalls when interpreting our results and where to draw caution for policy decisions. And that's why it's important to think about when interpreting our findings, to keep in mind the assumptions we made. So if there are any assumptions we made, we need to be open about them so that other people who are looking at our findings can think about those things when coming up with things that might have implications in terms of policy. And I think that's what we want to do. We want our results to inform policy. So we need to be transparent when interpreting our results. And for quantitative, there are key things we need to consider when interpreting our results. And the first one, if we are dealing with descriptive, I know Richard already talked about this. A lot of times we are focusing on the mean, but we know the mean has issues, especially if your data is not normally distributed. Because at times we focus on the mean and say majority of the people are above normal, yet our data is not normally distributed, yet you're just looking at the mean. So we need to think about that when focusing on the mean and the standard deviation, because they are only meaningful if our data follows a normal distribution, which majority of the time does not. Then the other thing to keep in mind is that when you're talking about statistical significance, it means that something is caused by something else other than chance, but it doesn't mean that it's important. So something might be statistically significant, but it's not important. You might see a difference which is statistically significant, but for clinical implication it's not important. So not everything that is statistically significant is important. Then there is the issue of bias. So we need to think about that when interpreting our findings. How did we select our participant? Was there any selection bias? Because it has implications when we are drawing conclusions. And keep in mind that if those biases, statistical analysis does not solve them. So if there are errors to do when you are collecting your data, to do with measurement error or selection of participants, statistics will not sort of that. But this has implications on our conclusions. And so we can only deal with these when thinking about the design that should ensure we have there's no selection bias, and think about our instruments so we don't have measurement error.
Can we avoid bias, particularly for qualitative HSR studies, especially reflecting on when we say most of the selections are purposive, that you get respondents and you purposively select respondents. So clearly, if you're going to talk about politics, you probably want to go and interview Odinga. I mean, I'm just using you an example. So the information that comes from Raila Odinga is clearly, we know where that information is relevant for us. So can we be able to avoid this bias given the selection mechanisms that we use under qualitative?
They will be such people. Otherwise,
You choose Kenyatta as well.
He's saying that Odinga is representative of the opposition, but the question is the opinions of Odinga the opinion of all the people in the opposition?
But also maybe the more question is, if you are going to talk about governance, and then you are going to choose Odinga, okay? What sort of information do you expect from Odinga on governance in Kenya?
In fact, with qualitative, I don't think the issue of bias is very important. Because basically we want perspectives. And whichever perspective that comes out is important. So the most worrisome bias is the investigator.
What they come
Putting your opinions on Oginga's perspective. That is what actually is the most worrisome thing in qualitative research.
As he has just done, now you're going to the father.
He's come with his own family. Because the father is
So you've got a very good example of putting your own.
You remember your peers.
But by virtue of the type of study you have, there's a selection bias anyway. As long as anyone is just makes that explicit in the way that you describe how your research was done, in terms of how your respondents were chosen, that's okay. I think the risk of bias also comes into
So if you are speaking to someone that's supposed to represent a political party, you're going to get a response bias. You're going to get a social acceptability bias. And those are the things that you have to be concerned about in terms of, are they really towing the party line? Are you getting real thoughts and beliefs and attitudes versus what they think you want to hear? And I think that's the trick when it comes to, the difficulty when it comes to qualitative interviews. And the only way to really overcome that is to ask the same question in very different ways at different parts of the interview, to see that whether you're getting a consistent response or different responses. And if you're getting different responses, then you can tease that out, and that's one way to overcome this social acceptability bias. I think it's more in the response, but as Prof said, it also depends on the way that you phrase your questions. So, are you leading the questions? Are you imposing your own biases? I think those are
Okay, for quantitative, the other key thing to think about is the issue of confounding. So when interpreting our results, we need to think about other things that could explain the results of our research. And there are several ways we can deal with the issue of confounding. One of them is we can think of it and deal with it at the design of the study. The other one is that we can measure or record potential confounders, so include them as variables in our data collection. And then when doing our analysis, we can adjust for confounders. Then there is the other whole issue of causation when interpreting our findings. Because majority of the time we do associations, and when we find there is an association, we start talking about causation. So those two words are very different. So association does not mean causation. And we should not interpret associations as causal relationships. So this is key when interpreting quantitative. Then when dealing with qualitative, so there are several things that we need to be careful and look into. One of them being the credibility of our results. So we should interpret our data in a way that we offer explanations that are consistent with the data that we collected. Then the other issue is the dependability. How replicable is a process, not the results necessarily, but can somebody else replicate the process that we use to get our data? Then there is the issue of confirmability, whereby other researchers, can they get our data and review them to verify our interpretation? Then the transferability. So we said that we might not be able to infer about the population for qualitative, but maybe based on what we got from our study, other places can learn from what we got. So not necessarily we can generalize, but maybe the conclusions we got other people might learn something from that. And I think that is the end of. I have some few references there, but I don't know whether there are other things we can add in terms of interpretation. I know it's a late afternoon, but thanks all for your contributions and comments.
No, these things of research methods, whenever I attended their classes, they looked so heavy, like they were used to reflect on mathematics. Whenever the math teacher came in, I was like, now this is going to be another But I'm happy that she's really simplified it for me. And I can probably say, with another little dose of it, I am ready to go and teach it. And you know, we say in the university, we don't have these mechanisms. Somebody is just employed the following day, you see them in class. No pedagogy, no nothing, and they are given a course to teach. So that's the challenge, and we are happy now that we are really getting into these aspects, and I'm sure we can be able to moving forward.
The CRB has been America's best selling.
That's the state of the nation. So thank you very much for the presentation and the preparation. You must have put notice. I was looking at the number of slides. So 26. That must have been like some 5 months work. Just imagine. You know, in teaching, when you teach one lecture, 1 hour lecture, you spend 12 hours to prepare. You know that? Require the curriculum, one of the curriculum people are trained, so you know this. So just replicate those hours and imagine this. So I think we need to give her another round. Oh, we are almost getting. I want to declare this day ended.
Tomorrow we are starting at 8.
Yeah. Now you are saying what I wanted to say.
It sounded like you were going to
Kindly help me to say so that
For reminding.
So I said tomorrow we are starting at 8 because we hope to end at 1:30. So the last thing we shall be having is after the lunch. So remember we have 2 sessions again and we must have the last thing as lunch.